All right, thank you, James. Thank you also to the Donovan Group for partnering with us to bring such an important service to our members. And then again, thank all of you for joining us this afternoon. I know you're all busy, but this is a really important topic, so I'm glad that you could take the time to join us. I'm going to start off with just a few important legal aspects for you to consider with respect to crisis and crisis communications before turning it over to Joe and Jerry to talk about what the Donovan Group can bring to you in your districts. So next slide, please. First thing, it's important to understand that a crisis doesn't have to be something like an active shooter or wildfire or some other catastrophe that strikes your district. It could be any sort of unexpected or urgent situation that disrupts campus and your ability to continue providing education to your students. This could be a pandemic, it could be an impasse or strike or other contentious labor negotiation situation. It could be protests on campus, or it could be something as simple as like a broken water main or extended power outage that strikes your district. And the specific legal implications of all of these are obviously going to vary depending on what the situation is. But it's important that during these kind of crises, you keep your legal team in the loop when a crisis strikes, because they can help to mitigate the situation itself and also help you avoid any potentially costly missteps along the way that you might later wish you had known about during the time of the crisis. So if you don't have legal counsel on staff, you can always reach out to CSBA. We're happy to help our members, and we are launching a new program this summer that's going to enable us to provide legal advice directly to your members, to our members, to your districts and county offices in a time of crisis or even just on day-to-day legal issues that you face. But regardless of whether you're coming to CSBA, your in-house counsel or an outside law firm, it's just important that you keep your attorneys involved whenever you are dealing with the kind of crises that would require a crisis communication plan. It's also really important that you have this communication plan in place and that you work with some professionals who can really help you out with developing those plans, because they're so critical in a time of crisis. And the last thing you want to be doing is figuring out how to communicate in the heat of the moment, right? If you've got the plan laid out up front, it's going to help you tremendously when you're faced with the crisis in the moment. They help you to ensure that you're getting accurate and timely information out to your students, parents, guardians, staff, the community, and even to the media at the times when it matters most. So that's why they're so critical. Next slide, please. Now, your communication plan could be a standalone document, or it could be part of something like a comprehensive safety plan or emergency disaster preparedness plan. I'm going to cover just a couple of quick things about those while we've got you here, because they are important plans for your districts and county offices. So every LEA is required to have a comprehensive safety plan. The education code spells out the specific components that need to be included in those plans. If you're not familiar with yours, you should take a look at Administrative Regulation 0450. That's the regulation for your district, your county office that deals with that plan. The plan itself requires you to have procedures for things like earthquake emergency procedures and all sorts of other issues that need to be incorporated into the plan. So it's also a good place that you can put a crisis communication plan, or to incorporate elements of it at least. Like I said, not every catastrophe, every crisis stems from a catastrophe, but every catastrophe is going to create a crisis, right? So having that plan there in the regulations or in your emergency response plan handy is going to make it a lot more convenient for you when those situations arise. For districts that have an average daily attendance of less than 2,500 students, you can do this at a school site level or at a district-wide level. So those are just some important things to remember about your comprehensive safety plan. Next slide, please. And while we're talking about the comprehensive safety plan, this is a little bit aside from crisis communication specifically, but there are some important things I just wanted to highlight and make sure you're thinking of while you're looking at these plans. First of all, and this is going to come up in any crisis, in order to be eligible for reimbursement of response-related personnel costs when you have a disaster, you need to make sure you're following the standardized emergency management system guidelines or coordinating with other agencies. This is going to be some of your communication dealing with those agencies and communicating back and forth, but this is another example of where having your attorneys involved up front is going to potentially save you a lot in the long run. So you want to make sure that you're doing that. You also need to make sure as a public agency that you comply with National Incident Management System requirements. In California, the coordinator for that is the Office of Emergency Services. So make sure that you're communicating and building in communications with OES and with your county office, who was often the liaison with OES, to make sure that they're included in your communication strategies. Next slide, please. So another place you might want to consider incorporating your communication plan is in your emergency and disaster preparedness plan. This is actually a separate policy, a separate plan from your comprehensive safety plan, but it's another place where these kind of communications are going to come up. You would find this in your board policy and administrative regulation 3516. There are also several sort of sub-regulations that deal with situational specific issues that you might face depending on where you live in the state and what your region is likely to face. You can, if you haven't already, you can adopt some of those additional regulations, or if you do have them in place, you might want to review them as you're developing your communication plans. So your emergency and disaster preparedness plan should include strategies and actions for preventing and mitigating disasters, preparing for disasters, response and recovery efforts. And these are going to include, some key things like determining roles and responsibilities for your staff, establishing a chain of command at both the district and the site level, because you may lose communication between the two. And then also planning, importantly for this conversation today, planning for communication during those emergencies. Next slide, please. Those communications, really what you should be identifying and thinking about up front, identifying a spokesperson. Who's going to be the one out there getting out that consistent message for your district? How are you going to account for the development and testing of communication platforms, right? You want to make sure that these things work in a time of crisis, so you're not finding out that your hotlines or telephone trees are outdated and not going to be useful during the situations when you need them most. You also want to make sure that you're including any information about how you distribute this for your district and school site levels. That needs to include staff, students, parents, and guardians to make sure that not only do you have the plan in place and the tools to deliver the communication, but people know where to go and how to expect to receive that information. And another aspect you're going to want to consider in there and include is your guidelines for when do you engage law enforcement. Keep in mind, some of that may fall within your tactical response plan that is not a public document, but it is something you want to consider when you're preparing and thinking about crisis communication and crisis planning. Next slide, please. So these next couple slides are really about dealing with some real targeted groups that you're going to be communicating with, probably the most important in a crisis in a lot of situations. Parents, right? We want to make sure that you're developing methods that ensure communications, which to the extent practical are going to be in the language and format that it's easy for the parents to understand and for your target audience to understand. Remember, if you have a population of students with 15% or more that speak a single language other than English as their primary language, you are required to provide translations of your annual notices and reports that go out to them. So keep that in mind in your communication planning, right? If you've got a population that fits within this and you've got a crisis, you want to make sure that your plan is developed in a way that's going to target those members of your school community as well. The education code also authorizes the school district, the principals, to verify, upon verification from law enforcement, provide written notice to parents and guardians of any violent crimes that occur on campus. Violent crime is anything for which a student could be expelled or which meets the definition listed out in the Ed Code. Could include homicides, some horrible things like rapes or robberies or aggravated assaults. And it's important to note that if you have one of these incidents happen, you need to make sure that you're sending out notice by the end of the second workday after receiving that verification from law enforcement. I bring this one up not just because it's an important legal issue, but it really goes to an important part of the communication plans. I've had some personal experience with this. My son, who's just graduated the 4th grade, has been in 2 different schools, and we have had the unfortunate situation of facing 2 different lockdowns in both those schools. One of those schools did a fantastic job dealing with it. They immediately reached out to parents through phone trees and electronic communication, kept us informed, let us know what was going on, what we could expect next. Even though it was a terrifying situation for us as parents, we felt comforted by the fact that we were in the loop and they were letting us know what was happening. The other school did not quite take the same approach. They sent us a letter 2 days after the event. They said that there was an event near campus, but it was taken care of. We really don't know what happened. We don't know the danger level that the kids were facing. Technically, they followed the 2-day notice requirement, but had they been thinking about this in advance or worked with someone like the Donovan Group, I'm sure they could have come up with a much better communication plan, which would have left everybody involved feeling significantly better about not only the situation, but the district itself and the school itself after the fact, right? That these kind of situations can greatly influence how the parents and how the community view your school overall, and it has long-lasting implications. Next slide, please. And of course, anytime you have a crisis of any nature, you can bet that there is going to be some level of media coverage. So there are a couple of things you want to remember about that from a legal perspective. First, you want to know which policies are going to apply. So I've listed some of those out here in this PowerPoint slide for you. Second, I think you want to remember that the penal code defines what an outsider is. So if you require outsiders to come and sign in when they come to campus, you should know that that does not include the media. If you instead require all visitors to come into the office and register when they get there, then that is going to include the media. And even though there is a freedom of speech issue with the press, the Attorney General has opined that you can restrict media representatives' access in the same manner that you can restrict the general public when you require all visitors to come in and register. So that means if you do have that requirement, when they come on campus, you can ask them to be accompanied by staff members when they're on school grounds, and you can do the same with media as you can with parents in that regard. You need to make sure that you've posted notices about whichever way you go, whether it's outsiders or all visitors. You should post notices of that policy on every entrance to the school grounds. That notice should describe registration requirements, school hours for which those registration requirements are imposed, and also direct them to where they can go and register. And then third, it's important to remember that the authority of a school board is as a unit. Whether you've got 3, 5, or 7 members, it's not always going to be the case that everybody shares the same opinion and viewpoint on everything, but everyone needs to be speaking with the same voice when it comes to crisis communication. So when you're dealing with crisis, it's important that you have a clear, concise message. And you might want to think about designating an official spokesperson to represent the board. If you don't know who that is for your board, you might want to take a look at Board Bylaw 9010. It is likely where you've designated someone, if you have designated them. A lot of school boards have designated their president to be that spokesperson via this bylaw. Next slide, please. And of course, finally, you don't want to forget that your students have rights as well. Specifically, they have freedom of speech rights, and when you're dealing with the media, they may want to come in and talk to some students. The Attorney General, again, has put out an opinion that says because students have a constitutional right to free speech, school administrators may not require prior written parental permission before allowing media representatives to interview students on campus. However, the law and case law support the idea that districts can adopt reasonable provisions for time, place, and manner restrictions so that we can control when the students do have that expression of their opinions and free speech, so it doesn't disrupt what's going on campus. So in some circumstances, it might be appropriate to limit the student's ability to talk with the media so it doesn't create a disruption, but this is a very complex area of law, and so again, I would recommend you speak with your attorneys before taking action in that arena. And then you may also have members of the media or other people asking for specific information about individual students. It's important to remember that directory information, as identified and defined in your administrative regulations, can be given out unless the parent has specifically submitted a request in writing saying that they don't want their students' directory information to be shared. That's not the same for homeless students. If a student is considered a homeless student, they actually have an opt-in versus an opt-out approach. So for homeless students, you cannot release directory information unless you have in writing a specific authorization to do so. So again, directory information, that's any information that's contained in a student record that would not generally be considered harmful or an invasion of privacy if it's disclosed. That's all spelled out for you in Administrative Regulation 5125.1. It doesn't include, just a couple of quick things to remind you of, it does not include social security numbers, you cannot give that out obviously, or their student identification numbers, or their citizenship status, immigration status, or place of birth. So those are some definite restrictions to know about. So now that I've covered probably a little too much about the law, I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to the Donovan Group and let them talk to you about crisis communication plans.